The compassion and sorrow on Keith's face touched a deep place inside Jill, refreshing parched soil long barren. It was as if he understood the depth of her pain and loss, even before she'd uttered a word of explanation. As if, somehow, he'd walked in her shoes and knew the road had been long and difficult and fraught with danger. She wondered why he seemed to have such insights, but she couldn't dwell on that now. He was waiting for her to speak, and she needed to focus on the story she had set herself up to tell. That was the last picture we ever had taken. We used it on our Christmas cards. Her words came out more hoarse than usual, and she cleared her throat. That's my husband, Sam, and my daughter, Emily. You all look happy. Keith continued to hold the photo, but his attention was riveted on the woman across from him. We were, blissfully so. It had never occurred to me that things could change in the blink of an eye, or a spark. Her grip on the mug tightened, whitening her knuckles. I had the flu and a bad cough that holiday season. I was sleeping in the guest room because Sam had been working long hours and needed his rest. My cough medicine had codeine in it, which knocked me out. That's probably why it took me such a long time to realize that something was wrong. She started to raise the cup to her lips, but her hands were so shaky that some of the liquid sloshed out, leaving a dark splotch on the oak table. She set the cup back down with the exaggerated care of a drunk. Anyway, when I woke up and smelled something burning, I panicked. I was running a high fever, and my thinking was fuzzy. So the whole sequence of events has always been as hazy as the smoke that was filling our house. I remember running down the hall. I woke Sam. He told me to go to the neighbors, to have them call 911. He said, "Get Emily." She drew a shuddering breath, and when she continued, her words were choppy, her voice unsteady. I alerted a neighbor and ran back to the house. Sam and Emily should have been out by then, but there was no sign of them. I ran toward the door. My neighbor grabbed my arm and tried to stop me. He said the fire department was coming. I heard the sirens, but I couldn't wait. I jerked free. When I got to the front door, all I could see was a wall of fire. I didn't care. I ran in anyway. But I only got as far as the stairs before a falling beam knocked me down. I was pinned to the floor, and the smoldering wood was angled against my face. And across the front of my left shoulder, I could hear She choked on the words, closing her eyes as a spasm of pain contorted her features. I could hear sizzling, and I realized it was my skin burning. The pain came next, agonizing pain. I thought I was dying. Later, I wished I had. The last words were whispered, and so wrought with anguish that Keith was left with no option but to take her hand, enfolding her cold fingers in the warmth and strength of his clasp. She didn't even seem to notice, so focused was she on the past. When she continued, her voice was flat and emotionless, her eyes glazed. I found out later that our Christmas tree had ignited. I'd always insisted on a real tree and those big old-fashioned colored light bulbs. Sam was in the insurance business, and he said it was safe. But I badgered him until he let me have my way. A hot bulb against dried up needles was the most common theory of how the fire started. Anyway, it went up in a flash. The fire spread with incredible speed, but the smoke was the worst. That's how Sam and Emily died. Smoke inhalation. Flames never touched them, thank God. But they touched you. Keith's voice was ragged, and he reached out to caress her scarred cheek. Much as Kyle had done, his fingers gentle. Startled by his touch, she nodded. Second and third-degree burns on my face and shoulder, and my vocal cords were irreparably damaged. I went through extensive treatment, including multiple skin grafts, for a year and a half. Deb took me in during that whole time. I'll never be able to repay her for that. I expect you would have done the same for her. That was true. They were family, and that's what families did. But that didn't diminish her gratitude. She was a rock. And she got answers for me that I was too injured to seek on my own. Like, why hadn't the fire alarm gone off? Turns out the battery was dead. We always changed it the first of the year, but for some reason, this one had run out way too soon. And she handled all of the paperwork for me. Being in insurance, Sam had taken out large policies on both of us. He'd seen too many cases where a spouse was left with nothing after a tragedy because the couple was young and didn't think insurance was necessary. Deb dealt with the insurance company and made sure all the T's were crossed and the I's dotted. She was determined that at least I'd have no financial worries. She got me all the money I was entitled to, but she couldn't get me the only thing I really wanted. Once more, Jill's voice choked, and she bowed her head. Keith's grip tightened, and she squeezed back a thank you. She hadn't cried once during the recitation, but when she looked at him, her eyes were brimming with tears. You're the first person I've ever shared that story with, except for family. Jolted, Keith stared at her. He wanted to ask why, then thought better of it, not sure he was ready for the answer. When he didn't respond, Jill sent him an uncertain look. It was more than you wanted to know, wasn't it? No. His reply was swift and sure. I've been wondering what happened ever since Deb mentioned your family. I'm glad you felt comfortable enough to tell me. And it makes me look at these in a whole new light. Once again, he ran a gentle finger down the scars on her face. What do you mean? They are a badge of honor, Jill. You got these trying to save your family. They represent courage and love and sacrifice. All those noble qualities we're called to display, but often don't. He didn't give her time to dwell on that comment, moving on to another question instead. How did you end up here? It took her a few beats to change gears. Well, when I was growing up, my family vacationed here one summer, and I always remembered it as a magical place, a place apart. It was the last vacation we had together before cancer took my dad. Mom and I came back once before she died 10 years ago. All my memories of this place were happy. I thought they could be again. And are they? His quiet question gave her pause, and she chose her words with care. In a different way. I've had a chance to pursue my art, which I'd always dreamed of doing. But don't you get lonely, Jill? His voice was gentle, but his expression was intent. Yes, Jill reflected. Of course she got lonely, especially since a certain carpenter had come into her life, reminding her of the simple joy of shared meals and light-hearted conversation, and just knowing another person was nearby. But she chose to answer in a different way. I'm not really alone. God has been by my side every day. That raised a whole new set of questions for Keith, ones that hit even closer to home. How did you manage to hold on to your faith after such loss? There was an undertone to Keith's question, a nuance, that told Jill the answer was important to him. A quick check of his eyes confirmed that impression. In their depths, she saw a yearning so intense that she forgot her own anguish and sought to ease his. It wasn't easy at first, she said slowly, struggling to put into words the turbulent faith journey of those first months after the accident. I'd always believed that God would be there to sustain me if I was ever given a heavy cross to bear. But in the beginning, I felt alone and abandoned. The God in whom I'd put my trust seemed to have vanished, along with all my hopes and dreams for the future. I called out to him over and over again, asking for comfort and guidance, asking why. Yet he seemed deaf to my pleading. Finally, I got angry and turned away from him. It was almost as if Jill had looked deep into his heart and told his own story, Keith realized with a start. The process she described was the same one he'd gone through, except he still felt alone and abandoned, while Jill had found her way back to her faith. How? What happened next? He prompted. I stopped searching for answers. Confused, he stared at her. What do you mean? I stopped asking why. That's it? Yes. I don't understand. She leaned forward, earnest and certain. Neither did I. And in the end, I realized I never would. That's my point. The thing is, Keith, God's ways aren't our ways. His plans surpass all our understanding. Seeking a logical explanation for what happened to me, it doesn't make sense to even try. There is no logical human answer. Only God knows why I was given that cross. Someday, when he and I are face to face, I might be given the wisdom to understand. But for now, it's beyond me. I had to learn to accept without understanding. She sat back, and there was a sense of peace about her when she continued. Once I did that, I started to hear his voice again. I suspect it was there all along, but the clamor of my questions, demands, even, was drowning it out, and my anger was blinding me to his presence. You can't reconnect with a loving God when your heart is filled with rage. So I let it go. And when I did, when I replaced it with love instead, God was waiting to welcome me back. That doesn't mean it was always smooth sailing after that. Some days were rougher than others. Despair resurfaced on occasion. But over time, it got better. The sorrow over my loss will always be with me, but at least it's easier to bear with God by my side. The silence in the room was broken only by the distant, plaintive call of a loon. Keith was awed and humbled by Jill's deep, abiding faith, a faith she'd struggled to hold on to despite God's apparent absence, while he had turned his back on the Almighty. And he had done so with what he now recognized as ignorance and arrogance, a sense of entitlement that he, of all people, should have God's ear during a crisis, that God should give him the answers denied to others, as if he was somehow better or more worthy? Well, if anyone was worthy of God's special grace, it was the woman sitting across from him, whose hand continued to rest in his. A woman who had recognized that love wasn't something to be grasped at or demanded, but given. Only then could it be returned. Only then could the voice of the beloved be heard with the heart. As he glanced at their entwined hands, Jill looked down as well and seemed surprised to discover that her fingers were still engulfed in his clasp. A flush of color suffused her cheeks, and she gave her hand a gentle tug. But Keith's grip tightened. He didn't want to let go, not yet. Her hand was like a lifeline, her goodness and kindness flowing through her fingertips directly into his soul. Surprised, she looked back at him, a question in her eyes. But he had no answers yet. With one more gentle squeeze, he forced himself to release her slender fingers and stand. Thank you for sharing all of that with me. He moved toward the door, pausing on the threshold. Lock this after me. Okay. She rose and joined him at the door, expecting him to exit at once. Instead, he stood there, looking down at her with an expression that was hard to read. She saw gratitude in his eyes, colored with some other emotion she couldn't quite identify. But it was deep and rich and full, and it reached inside her heart, nudging to life a flame she'd thought had long ago died. Her own eyes widened in surprise as their gazes locked and held. Mesmerized, she watched him swallow hard. Several eternal beats of silence ticked by as a storm of emotion swirled in the still air. Then all at once he turned and fumbled for the door. Sleep well, Jill. I'll see you tomorrow. His voice was as rough as the outer layer of bark on the madrone trees that thrived on the island, as unsteady as a newborn black-tailed deer, as confused as a sailor set adrift on the open sea without a compass. Her hands trembling, Jill shut the door behind him and slid the lock into place, leaning against the hardwood as she closed her eyes. She knew that Keith Michaels had been tempted to kiss her, for reasons that neither of them seemed to understand. Sympathy, maybe, or pity, or perhaps to comfort her after the story she had just told him. Whatever the motivation, she was convinced he'd considered it. And she was even more convinced that she'd have let him. Another surge of longing rippled through her, and she struggled to subdue it. She couldn't let herself get carried away. Okay, so maybe Keith liked her. even cared about her as a friend, enough to kiss her out of compassion or consolation. But she didn't want kisses motivated by pity. Unfortunately, since those were the only kind she was ever likely to get, she'd best learn to do without, even from a man who touched her heart in a very special way. Keith, it's good to hear from you, son. The affection in Bob Michael's voice was unmistakable, and Keith smiled. Thanks, Dad. Sorry it's been a whole week. I've been busy with the studio. How's it coming? Great. Things move a little slower on the island, though, so it takes a while to get some of the other crafts people out to their property. But we're about halfway there. Glad to hear it. Everything else okay? Yeah, I think so. 2 beats of silence ticked by. Want to tell me about it, son? The man had an uncanny ability to pick up on the most subtle vibes. Keith acknowledged with a shake of his head. In fact, there were times when he was sure his father was a mind reader. This was one of them, and, in all honesty, hadn't he hoped for such a question? His father had always been a good sounding board, and Keith could use some feedback about now. I never could get anything past you, could I, Dad? The older man chuckled. Oh, I expect you managed to slip a few things by me through the years. A grin lifted the corner of Keith's mouth. Not many, and not this time. He stopped, trying to figure out how to put into words the jumble of emotions he was feeling. In the end, he decided to start with God. I've started to pray again, Dad. On the other end of the line, Bob Michaels closed his eyes. Thank you, Lord. Tell me about it. Well, it's not really prayer, at least not in a formal sense, nor is it even a conscious decision. It's just that I've started, I don't know, I guess talking to God is the best way to describe it. Sort of a spontaneous thing. That's the best kind of prayer in my book. Is he talking back? Not yet, but I'm starting to think he might be listening. Then it won't be long before you hear his voice again, son. That's how it started and worked for Jill. Interesting. It seemed his landlady had had a hand in Keith's change of heart, Bob reflected. Even better. Another thank you, Lord. She sounds like a godly woman. She is. Someday I'll tell you all about her. But not today, Keith suddenly decided. He needed to sort through his feelings first. I'd like that. I'll call again soon. God be with you, Dad, and with you. As Keith hung up the phone, he realized that he'd reverted to their traditional sign-off, with him initiating the blessing. And he realized something else as well. It felt good. Keith, wait up! Still deep in thought from his conversation with his father, Keith didn't realize at first that he'd been hailed, but when the voice at last registered, he halted his trek toward the East Sound side street where he'd parked his car. Turning, he saw Larry Miller heading his way. With his young, long, gray hair tied back in a ponytail, and his propensity for tie-dyed t-shirts, the electrician always reminded Keith of a hippie. But despite his laid-back manner, the man knew his stuff. He'd been out to the studio twice already, and was scheduled for one more visit to do a final hookup. Hi, Larry. What's up? Listen, I was talking to some folks over in Deer Harbor yesterday. They're getting ready to put an addition on their house and asked me to recommend a good carpenter. I thought of you right away. You interested in the work? They aren't going to start until November or December, and I figure you'll be done with the studio long before that. A job. He was being offered a paying job. But Keith hadn't thought that far ahead yet. Would he still be here in November? Did he still want to be here in November? I'm not sure what my plans are yet, he told the man. That's cool. Just think about it. They won't be deciding on contractors for a while. Let me know when you need me to come out to the Whalen place to finish up. With a wave, the man sauntered off down the street. Was this a sign? Keith wondered. Was there a message in this unexpected job offer? And if so, what was it? No answers presented themselves. But instead of feeling overwhelmed or panicked, as he had so often during these past 2 years when uncertainty plagued him, Keith followed Jill's example. He took a deep breath and put the issue in the Lord's hands. Perhaps, in his time, the answers would come. Morning, Jill. I was passing by and thought I'd drop in to check on the progress of your studio. It's looking good. At the sound of Madeline DeWitt's voice, Jill turned away from the forest. She'd taken to scanning it several times a day from the back porch, hoping to spot Kyle. But since his grandfather's visit the week before, there'd been no sign of him, and she was worried. Hello, Madeline. As always, the gallery owner artist rep attire was stylish, with an unmistakable flair that Jill had always admired. Today, her jet black hair was caught at the nape of her neck with a beaded clasp that Jill was sure reflected the hand of a local jewelry designer. Black slacks and a Babel turtleneck were offset by a fuchsia pink blazer, while the hand-painted scarf draped around her neck added an elegant torch. Sorry to drop in unannounced, but I brought some cinnamon rolls from Cafe Olga to make amends. She lifted a large white bag. It was the same conversation they always had. Madeline never called, not even for her first visit, when she'd followed up on a letter Jill had sent with some photos of her paintings. Madeline had been interested in displaying them in her gallery in East Sound, but Jill had declined her invitation to come into town to discuss it. Nor had she invited Madeline to her home. So the woman had just shown up one day with apologies and Olga's cinnamon rolls. Never once had Jill invited her inside. They'd always chatted on the porch, Jill's hat pulled low. But today she'd been caught without it. More and more, she was forgetting to wear it around the house. Suddenly self-conscious, her hand fluttered to her cheek and she angled her body away from the woman. When Jill didn't respond, Madeline lowered the bag to her side. Are you working on anything interesting? Her tone remained bright and friendly. Jill risked a glance at her. The woman wasn't paying a bit of attention to her scars. In fact, now that she thought about it, other than a brief flicker of surprise when they'd met, Madeline had never given any indication that she noticed them. Her reaction had been much like Keith's and Cindy's. Perhaps Deb had been right, Jill conceded. Maybe some people could get past her disfigurement and treat her as a normal person if she gave them a chance instead of shutting them out by retreating behind a wall of aloofness. For years, she'd told herself she'd withdrawn from the world because she was wary of being treated differently. But all at once, with a jarring insight, she realized that wasn't her only motivation, or even the main one. In truth, it was just safer when people felt ill at ease around her. Their discomfort ensured that she never had to talk to them long enough to reveal anything about her past. That, in turn, allowed her to keep all her grief and traumatic memories buried deep in her subconscious, surrounded by thick, impenetrable walls. In other words, for the price of isolation, she got insulation. It seemed Deb wasn't the only one whose insight was sound, she acknowledged, as a second truth hit home. Keith's comment over pizza that day had been on the mark too. She had been hiding. But now that she'd shared some of her memories with him and survived, they seemed to have lost their power to trigger the wrenching anguish that had once twisted her stomach into knots. Armed with that knowledge, she had the courage to risk breaking down the protective walls a little further. Yes, I've got a few new pieces in the works, Jill responded. Would you like to come up and see them? Surprise flashed across Madeline's face, followed by a warm smile. I'd love to. As they passed through the kitchen, Madeline deposited the white bag on the counter. Maybe we could, if you have time. It might be nice to have a cup of coffee and sample those before you leave, Jill offered in a halting voice. Madeline's smile widened. Now that's an offer I can't refuse. It's impossible to say no to Olga's cinnamon rolls. A few minutes later, after Madeline had silently perused Jill's in progress works wearing her serious art expert expression, she turned to be a client. As always, Jill's nerves kicked in as she waited for the woman's evaluation. She'd come to respect Madeline's judgment, and she knew the gallery owner would be honest and fair in her assessment. I have only one word for these new pieces. Wow. Crinkles appeared at the corner of Madeline's eyes as she smiled. Relaxing, Jill smiled back. Thanks. Your seascapes and landscapes are always great, Jill. Madeline turned back to examining again the three works in progress. But I'm glad you're starting to include people in your paintings. I love this one of the little boy looking straight at us, half in and half out of the shadows. It's evocative, and it raises questions, as all great portraits do. And this one, she gestured toward a canvas showing two young boys intent on their task of feeding a baby bird. This one spoke of friendship and a childhood innocence and nurturing. I love it. And even this landscape, it would work without the man in the far distance, looking toward the heavens. But the inclusion of that figure gives it humanity and hope, somehow. This is stellar work. Flushed with pleasure, Jill smiled. She'd thought the pieces were good too, but it was nice to hear her own assessment confirmed by an expert. Thank you. I'm just being honest. Now, how about that coffee? 10 minutes later, after both were seated at the kitchen table, which, it seemed, was fast becoming a gathering place, Madeline took a bite of her cinnamon roll and closed her eyes. Ah, fabulous. I agree, Jill seconded. When she finished chewing, Madeline leaned forward and rested her elbows on the table, tapping one perfectly manicured nail in the exact shade of pink as her blazer against the mug she held in her hands. I have some good news. A rep from a very prestigious gallery in Seattle stopped by a few weeks ago. He was quite taken with your work and bought a couple of pieces. Both have been sold, and he's interested in more. Not only that, he'd like to host a show of your work at his gallery in December, and he'd like you to attend the opening. Up until the last sentence, Jill had been excited. But a public appearance? No way. She opened her mouth to decline, but Madeline spoke first. I know you don't get out a lot, Jill. In fact, I almost didn't bring it up. But when you asked me in today, I don't know. I had a feeling things might have changed. In any case, please think about it, at least. It would be great promotion and a real boost for your career. Torn, Jill stared at the woman. She hadn't gone into painting to become famous. The insurance settlement had been substantial, and it was heavily invested wisely, ensuring her a good living for a very long time. Still, it would be nice to have her work receive some recognition. For self-satisfaction, if nothing else. But appearing in public, being the center of attention at a gallery opening, it was too much of a stretch. She hadn't even ventured off the island in 2 years. I appreciate the opportunity, Madeline, and your support, but I don't think. The sound of footsteps on the wooden back porch interrupted them, and Jill turned to find Keith framed in the doorway. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you had company. He started to turn away, but Jill rose. It's okay. Come on in. I'd like you to meet Madeline. The other woman also rose, extending her hand as Keith stepped inside and Jill made the introductions. So, you're the man who's building that great studio, Madeline commented. Guilty. Tilting her head, she studied him. I've been around here long enough to know most of the faces, and I don't recognize yours. You must be new to the island. Yes, I came in July. Jill took me in during the storm, when there wasn't a room to be had over the holiday weekend, and I ended up staying to build the studio. You're staying here? Madeline's eyebrows rose, and she shot Jill a speculative look. In the cabin, Jill interjected quickly as her neck grew warm. Of course. Well, Keith, I want you to know you're supporting the work of a very talented artist who would be on her way to fame if she'd accept an offer from a gallery in Seattle for a show. But I'm not having any luck convincing her. It was as if Madeline had sensed an ally in Keith, Jill thought, giving her a shrewd glance. But the other woman's expression remained innocent. A gallery in Seattle wants to feature your work? Now it was Keith's turn to look at her. There was no wondering about his expression. It was genuine pleasure. That's great. How come you don't want to do it? They want me to come to the opening. Okay. For an instant he seemed puzzled, as if he had forgotten about the way she looked and couldn't figure out why a personal appearance was a stumbling block. Then comprehension dawned. Oh. Reaching for her purse, Madeline took that as her cue to exit. See what you can do to convince her, Keith. We have a star in the making here. Jill, I'll be in touch. Let me know when those paintings you're working on are finished, and I'll swing by and pick them up. Or you could deliver them to the gallery and we'll go to lunch. Without waiting for a reply, she waved and pushed through the screen door. Though she knew Keith was watching her, Jill busied herself at the sink, but she wasn't surprised when he pursued the subject. Maybe you should consider doing the show, Jill. I've only seen the half-finished pieces you're working on outside, and I'm no artist. But even I can tell that you have talent. I can't, Keith. The silence in the room was broken only by the clink of cutlery as she tied it up from her impromptu coffee break. Please, Lord, let him drop the subject, she prayed. I'm not ready for anything like that. Would you consider it? I mean, I know it would be tough to do that alone, but if you had friends with you, Madeline would be there, I'm sure. And if it would help, I could, well, I'd be happy to go with you. Honored, in fact. Her hands stilled, and a sudden rush of tenderness tightened her throat. This man's caring and compassion had done more to brighten her life in the past few weeks than all of the accolades she'd received for her work since launching her new career. But there was one piece of information he didn't know, and she had to share it, even though she was afraid to hear his response. She spoke without turning toward him. The show wouldn't be until December, Keith. The silence that greeted her comment was more telling than words. No quick reassurances that the timing didn't matter, that he'd be around. Not that she'd expect him to be, of course. All along, she'd known this was a temporary arrangement, that as soon as the studio was finished, he'd move on. But she hadn't had to confront it directly until now. I didn't realize that. Keith wanted to tell her that he'd still be on the island in December, but in truth, he didn't know where he'd be by then. Of course not. It's okay. I appreciate the thought anyways. Well, I guess I'll get back to work. The screen door opened, then closed behind her. She listened as his steps echoed across the back porch and down the stairs, finally disappearing in the distance, leaving her alone. The way she would be again in the not too distant future. He was back. Jill stopped sweeping and stared. For a second, she almost didn't believe her eyes when she saw Kyle emerge from the woods in the fading light. It had been almost 2 weeks since the upsetting visit from his grandfather. 2 weeks with Rory, 2 weeks with Rory as her constant companion. On more than one occasion, she'd picked up the phone to call Cindy, to plead with her to do a follow-up visit, but the woman seemed conscientious, and Jill felt confident she was already doing everything she could. Now it didn't matter. Kyle was here. She set the broom aside and took the steps at a run, calling over her shoulder to Keith, who was working late on the studio. Kyle's here. But Jill's elevation evaporated Once she was close enough to get a good look at the little boy. Panic etched his features, and given his labored breathing, she suspected that he'd been running at full speed since leaving the house. There was a long scratch on his cheek, and his hands were scraped and bloody. Her protective instincts kicked in, and she pulled him into the shelter of her arms, scanning the dark woods over his shoulder with trepidation as her heart kicked into double time. It's okay, Kyle. It's okay. You don't have to be afraid. You're safe here. His thin chest was heaving, and she stroked his back, trying to calm him. With surprising force, he pulled out of her embrace and clutched her arms, his grip loosening and tightening convulsively. His panic hadn't abated one iota. If anything, it had ratcheted up a notch. His mouth worked, as if he was trying to speak, and Jill smoothed his tousled hair back from his forehead, trying to control her own accelerating alarm. What is it, Kyle? Can you tell me? His attention shifted over her shoulder, and Jill half turned to see Keith approaching. But this time, the man's presence didn't seem to faze the boy. Kyle didn't budge, though his whole body was trembling. What's wrong? Keith stopped a couple of feet away and dropped to their level, resting on the balls of his feet. I don't know. Jill tried to figure out what could have caused such panic in the boy, but came up with the only explanation. Is your grandfather following you, Kyle? He shook his head, then reached for her hand and tugged, urging her towards the woods. Surprised, Jill turned to Keith. I think he wants us to follow him. I don't like that idea, considering our encounter with a certain gentleman a couple of weeks ago. Why don't I... Help! The single word came out in a croak, like a rusty hinge on a long unused gate. Startled, Jill and Keith turned to Kyle in unison. When neither reacted at once, he tugged again. Truck! Fell! At last, Jill found her voice. Is your grandfather hurt, Kyle? At his vigorous nod, Keith rose. Is he near the cabin, Kyle? Again the boy nodded. Jill, where's the cabin from here? Northwest, about a quarter of a mile. Keith took off toward the woods at a jog. Call 911, he called over his shoulder. Wait, it might be better if we... But he was already 50 feet away and disappearing fast. Later, much later, when car headlights pierced the gloom of her darkened living room, Jill eased away from a sleeping Kyle and headed toward the front door. A police car was inching up her narrow driveway, and for a moment Jill panicked. Had something happened to Keith, too? Fear clogged her throat, and she stopped breathing. Not until she saw him emerge from the car did her lungs kick in again. With a wave, he turned it toward the porch, where a dim bulb illuminated the night. The car did a U-turn and headed back down the driveway, the red taillights blinking as it wound through the forest, the crunch of gravel under the tires the only sound in the still air. Not until he drew close did Keith realize that Jill was waiting for him on the porch. Pausing, he looked up at her and raked his fingers through his hair. Rough night. The weary lines scored on his face, the grease stains on his shirt, and the long, jagged tear in his jeans offered proof of that. Her first instinct was to throw herself into his arms, to comfort him, as she'd earlier comforted Kyle. Instead, she jammed her hands in the pockets of her jeans and stayed where she was. Can I get you some coffee? No, thanks. I just want to sit a minute. How's Kyle? He lowered himself to the porch steps carefully, every motion conveying his exhaustion. She sat beside him. He's sleeping on the couch in the living room. It took me a while to settle him down. I don't doubt it. He let out a long, slow breath and rubbed a hand down his face. Things were hectic, or I'd have called. It's okay. How's his grandfather doing? Clasping his hands between his knees, he stared down. There's no easy way to say this, I guess. He didn't make it, Jill. Jolted, she stared at him. You mean he's dead? Yeah. I guess the jack slipped and the truck fell, pinning him underneath. When I got there, he was unconscious, but alive. I managed to reset the jack and get the truck off of him, but he was pretty far gone already. The paramedics did what they could, but after a few minutes they gave up. There'll be an autopsy, of course, but I suspect the cause of death will be massive internal injuries. Though her dealings with the man had been anything but cordial, and she'd resented his poor care of Kyle, Jill nevertheless took a moment to commend him to God, who was, after all, the ultimate judge. Yet, even as she sent that silent prayer heavenward, she couldn't help but think that Kyle would be better off without the man. Except, who did he have now? His father didn't want him. His mother was dead. There'd be no mention of any other relatives. It's Kyle I'm worried about. Keith's comment echoed her thoughts. Me too. I'll call Cindy in the morning. What will happen to him now? He'll be placed in a foster home. That's the usual procedure in a case like this. But what about long term? He might stay in the foster system forever, unless someone adopts him. Dismay washed over Jill. In his young life, Kyle had already known too much ill treatment, too much instability. In the foster system, he could very well be passed around like an unwanted Christmas fruitcake. What he needed was a secure, loving home, a place where he could learn to trust and relax and be a child again, an environment where he would be cherished and nurtured. A place like Rainbow's End. The solution was so obvious, so perfect, so right, that Jill didn't even want to think about it. I could take him in. In the dark, Keith turned to her. The porch fixture cast light on half of his face, leaving the other half in shadows. I had a feeling you might say that. There was a nuance in his voice that brought a furrow to her bow. You don't sound too encouraging. He gave a heavy sigh and raked his fingers through his hair again. Don't get me wrong, Jill. I've seen you with Kyle, and with Dominic, and with the baby bird. I know what a caring, nurturing person you are. I think you'd be just what the doctor had ordered for Kyle. But? But being approved as a foster parent isn't that easy. In general, the state looks for two-parent families. He didn't have that before. Biological families get away with it a lot. Too much in some cases. But foster and adoptive parents are put through the mill. Background checks, home visits, the whole 9 yards, and it takes time. Kyle doesn't have time. I'm not the one you have to convince. I'll talk to Cindy tomorrow. She started to rise, but Keith reached for her arm, holding her in place. Don't get your hopes up, okay? But I'd be a good foster parent. I know. Think about this, though. As much as Kyle needs love and nurturing, he also needs professional help after all he's been through. Medical tests and eye care and psychological counseling for a start. That means a lot of trips into town, a lot of paperwork and dealing with bureaucracy. In other words, a lot of interacting with people. Jill wanted to say that she could handle all that. But hadn't she told Madeline only a few days before that she wasn't sure she was ready to go to Seattle? Or even a one-night gallery opening? If she couldn't do that, how in the world could she cope with meeting all of Kyle's needs? Which would require more than one quick visit to a city. Her shoulders slumped. Tugging free of Keith's arm, she stood. I'm heading to bed, and you should do the same. It's been a long day. I'm not trying to discourage you, Jill. I just think there are a lot of things to consider. Yeah. She moved toward the door, turning when Keith's voice stopped her. If you want my opinion, I think you should go for it. He'd risen and was facing her now, the golden porch light illuminating his weary face as he looked up at her. I think you can overcome the obstacles. I believe in you. His words warmed her, and gratitude filled her eyes. Thanks. I wish I had your confidence. Give it to the Lord in prayer. The ghost of a smile played at her lips. He's the first person I plan to talk to.